November 1943. The winds sweeping across the flat south countryside carry the heavy, droning vibration of engines. At the edge of the perimeter fence surrounding the Le Mans airfield, the grass is overgrown, damp with the morning mist of occupied France. Standing alone in this field, just yards away from the armed sentries of the Luftwaffe, is a 12-year-old boy. He holds a simple wooden spool of string, his eyes fixed upward on a kite dancing erratically in the grey sky. To the German guards patrolling the wire, he is part of the scenery, a harmless, distracted French child, amusing himself while the war grinds on around him. They offer him a wave, perhaps a smile, seeing only innocence. They do not see his eyes shifting from the kite to the runway. They do not know that with every glance he is memorizing the markings on the Junkers Ju-88 bombers taxiing for takeoff. He is not just a boy playing in the shadow of the Third Reich. He is the Resistance's most effective surveillance asset, hiding in plain sight. The path that brought a child to the perimeter of a Luftwaffe airfield began 3 years earlier, in the catastrophic summer of 1940. The collapse of the French Third Republic was not merely a military defeat. It was a psychological dismantling of a nation. In June, the roads of the Sarthe region became clogged with the debris of a fleeing army and the panic of the civilian exodus. The air was thick with the smoke of burning documents and the dust of retreating columns. Then came the silence, followed by the rhythmic stomp of jackboots. When the Wehrmacht entered Le Mans, they did not come as a ragtag force, but as highly disciplined conquerors. They commandeered the best hotels, the administrative buildings, and, crucially, the infrastructure. The swastika was draped over the prefecture, a stark splash of red against the grey stone, signaling the end of liberty. For the local population, the occupation was an immediate, suffocating reality. Rationing began, curfews were enforced with lethal strictness, and the German Feldgendarmerie became a permanent fixture on the cobblestone streets. Le Mans was a strategic prize. It was a transportation hub connecting Paris to the west, but more importantly, it possessed an airfield. The Germans immediately recognized the value of the terrain. The airfield was expanded, hangars were reinforced, and it became a nest for the Luftwaffe, a base from which they could strike at Allied shipping or defend the airspace of occupied France. The roar of engines became the soundtrack of daily life for the residents, a constant reminder of the enemy's technological superiority and entrenched power. Inside this occupied zone lived the Auduc family. They were not soldiers, nor were they politicians. They were ordinary French citizens who found the reality of submission intolerable. Jean Auduc, the father, was a man of quiet but fierce convictions. He had seen the humiliation of his country and refused to accept it as permanent. His wife, Biella, shared this resolve. In the privacy of their home, away from the prying ears of collaborators and the patrols outside, the atmosphere was not one of resignation, but of simmering defiance. Jean-Jacques was only 9 years old when the Germans marched in, at an age where a child's world is usually defined by schoolyards and games. His was abruptly reshaped by the presence of the invader. He watched as the adults around him lowered their voices. He saw the fear in the eyes of neighbors and the arrogance of the occupying troops. Children are often dismissed as oblivious observers, but they are uniquely sensitive to the emotional currents of their environment. Jean-Jacques absorbed the tension. He understood, with the moral clarity that only a child possesses, that the men in the grey uniforms were the enemy. By 1941, the initial shock of defeat had worn off. replaced by the grim grind of the occupation. The Germans were comfortable. They believed the war in the West was won. But beneath the surface, the first tendrils of the resistance were beginning to form. It was disorganized at first, consisting of isolated acts of sabotage, graffiti, and the distribution of illicit pamphlets. However, the British Special Operations Executive began looking for footholds in France, seeking reliable local networks to gather intelligence and prepare for a future liberation that still seemed impossibly distant. The Auduc family was perfectly positioned to be part of this shadow war. They lived near the airfield. They were trusted in their community. But joining the resistance was not like enlisting in a regular army. There were no recruiters, no uniforms, and no barracks. It was a gradual slide into illegality. It started with small acts like passing a message, hiding a package, or listening to the forbidden broadcasts of the BBC. For Jean Auduc, the decision to escalate from passive hatred to active resistance was inevitable. He began to make contacts, tenuous links that connected him to the nascent Buckmaster network, named after the head of the SOE's French section, Maurice Buckmaster. The danger of this choice cannot be overstated. In 1941 and 1942, the German counterintelligence services, the Abwehr, and later the Gestapo, were ruthlessly efficient. They relied on a network of informers, the corbeaux, French citizens who betrayed their neighbors for money or favor. Trust was a rare currency. To bring a resistance network into one's home was to endanger everyone under that roof. Most parents would have done anything to shield their son from such peril, but the Auducs were different. They did not exclude Jean-Jacques from the reality of their war. Instead, as the network began to take shape around their dining table, the boy sat and listened, his childhood fading as his education in espionage began. The organization that the Auduc family joined was part of the scientist circuit, a sub-branch of the sprawling Buckmaster network that operated under the direct guidance of London. In the rural farmhouses and quiet townhomes of the Sarthe, the resistance was transforming from a sentiment into a logistical machine. The SOE provided the structure, radios for communication, codes for encryption, and weapons for the eventual uprising. But London did not need soldiers in Le Mans yet. They needed information. The Le Mans airfield had evolved into a critical node in the Luftwaffe's western defense wall. It was no longer just a transit point. It was an active operational base housing bomber units and night fighter squadrons tasked with intercepting RAF streams heading for Germany. Concrete bunkers were poured to shelter the aircraft. Flak batteries, heavy 80mm anti-aircraft guns were dug into the surrounding fields, their barrels tracking the sky. For Allied planners, this base was a thorn in their side. A launch pad that threatened the convoys in the Channel and the bombers over the continent. To neutralize it, the Allies needed to strike with precision. High-altitude reconnaissance photos taken by Spitfires were useful, but they were static and often grainy. They could show a runway, but they could not distinguish between a real Ju-88 bomber and a wooden decoy. They could not tell if a fuel truck was empty or full, or reveal the rotation schedules of the guard patrols. The RAF needed granular human intelligence. They needed to know exactly where the ammunition bunkers were buried and which hangars housed the mechanics. Gathering this intelligence was a suicide mission for an adult. The Wehrmacht had established a red zone around the perimeter. Any French male of military age found loitering near the fences was immediately detained as a terror suspect or a saboteur. Women were stopped and searched. their papers scrutinized by the Feldgendarmerie. The Germans were paranoid, professional, and thorough. They had secured the ground against every conventional threat, creating a sterile zone where no spy could operate unnoticed. This tactical deadlock created a unique problem for the local resistance cell. They had the radio to send the message, but they could not get close enough to get the data. The Auduc home, now functioning as a hub for the network, buzzed with this frustration. Maps were spread out on tables behind drawn curtains, but the details of the airfield's interior remained blank spaces. The network needed a ghost, someone who could walk through the German security screen without triggering a reaction. They needed an agent who was invisible not because of stealth, but because of bias. It was in this gap between the desperate need for intelligence and the impossibility of access that Jean-Jacques found his purpose. The Germans were looking for men with guns or women with radios. They were not looking for a schoolboy with a bicycle. The very arrogance of the master race, their belief that they were the supreme authority, blinded them to the threat posed by a child. This blindness was the only gap in their armor, and it was the angle the Auduc family decided to exploit. The operational concept was terrifyingly simple. Jean-Jacques, now 12 years old, would become the eyes of the SOE. While the resistance fighters sharpened their knives in the shadows, he would walk into the sunlight. His primary tool was a bicycle, a rusty, unremarkable frame that squeaked as he pedaled down the country lanes. His cover story was non-existent because it didn't need to exist. He was just a bored child roaming the countryside. He would ride up to the perimeter wire of the airfield, sometimes alone, sometimes with other children he had recruited into unwitting accomplices. To the German sentries standing guard in their grey greatcoats, bored and homesick, the sight of a French boy was a distraction, a brief connection to the normal life they had left behind in Hamburg or Bavaria. Jean-Jacques played the role perfectly. He would stop his bike, feigning a loose chain or a flat tire right in front of the hangars. While his hands fumbled with the metal, his eyes were scanning. He learned to differentiate the aircraft silhouettes instantly. The twin-engine Heinkel 111 with its glass nose. The jagged profile of the Junkers 88. He counted them. 1, 2, 3 on the tarmac. 2 more in the open hangar. He noted the fuel trucks, how often they arrived, where they parked. This was not a game of memory. It was life or death data collection. His most ingenious tool, however, was his kite. It was a masterpiece of improvised espionage. He would stand in the fields adjacent to the runway, launching the kite into the wind. The Germans watched him, sometimes even laughing or cheering him on as the kite dipped and dived. They saw a toy. Jean-Jacques saw a measuring instrument. By positioning himself at specific points along the fence and noting the angle of the kite string relative to the buildings, he could triangulate the positions of the hidden infrastructure. He could estimate the length of the new runway extensions based on where his kite hovered. But looking was not enough. The details had to be recorded. He couldn't carry a notebook, for if a guard searched him and found a list of bomber serial numbers, he would be shot on the spot. So Jean-Jacques turned his mind into a filing cabinet. He developed mnemonic devices to store the data. He would memorize the insignia painted on the fuselages, the black crosses, the squadron emblems. He noted the color of the smoke from the chimneys to determine if the barracks were occupied. The level of detail he gathered was astonishing. He observed the uniforms of the officers entering specific buildings, deducing which ones were command posts and which were merely mess halls. He watched the construction crews, counting the cement trucks to estimate the thickness of the new bunker walls. This was forensic observation conducted by a boy who should have been worrying about math homework. Once he had filled his memory, he would cycle back home, his heart pounding against his ribs. The transition was jarring. 1 minute he was smiling at a Nazi soldier. The next, he was in the kitchen with his father and the radio operator. He would recite what he had seen, the numbers tumbling out of him while the adults transcribed them onto grid paper. These reports were then encoded, turned into bursts of Morse code, and beamed across the channel to intelligence officers in London, who marveled at the precision of the reports coming from source Jean-Jacques. Inside the Auduc household, the war had dissolved the boundaries of domestic life. The kitchen table was no longer just for meals, it was a forward operating base. For Jean-Jacques, this meant living in a state of perpetual schizophrenia. Outside, he was the carefree boy with the kite. Inside, he was a co-conspirator in high treason. The stress of this double life was a crushing weight for a 12-year-old. He had to police his own speech constantly. A slip of the tongue at school, a boast to a friend, or a wrong look at a collaborator in the village could doom his entire family. He learned the art of silence. He became watchful, reading the moods of adults, sensing danger in a pause or a glance. The innocence of his childhood was not lost. It was voluntarily suppressed, replaced by a cold, hard vigilance. The stakes escalated when the network began using the Auduc home to hide downed Allied airmen. These were men who had bailed out of burning Lancasters or B-17s, terrified and disoriented, hunted by German patrols with dogs. Jean-Jacques watched as his parents ushered these strangers into their attic or cellar. He saw the fear in the eyes of these invincible aviators. He brought them food, listened to their whispered English, and understood that these men were the cargo his family was risking their lives to protect. The presence of the radio operator, a man sent from London, added another layer of lethal danger. Transmitting was the most perilous act of all. The Germans had gonimetric vans, direction-finding trucks that prowled the streets of Le Mans, scanning the airways for the telltale spike of an unauthorized signal. When the operator keyed his set, tapping out the Morse code that Jean-Jacques had helped generate, the air in the house grew tight. Jean-Jacques would often be sent outside to keep watch, standing in the dark street, listening for the sound of a truck engine, knowing that his signal, a cough or a whistle, was the only thing standing between his family and the firing squad. There were moments where the mask almost slipped. Once a German officer billeted nearby entered the house unexpectedly. The radio was hidden, but the tension was palpable. Jean-Jacques had to act normal, to play with a toy, to be the child the German expected to see, while his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He realized then that the enemy was not just a military force. They were human beings, which made the deception even more terrifying. To lie to a faceless monster is one thing. To lie to a man who is offering you a piece of chocolate requires a steeliness that few adults possess. The moral burden on his parents was immense. They were using their son as a weapon. In any other time, this would be unconscionable. But in the context of total war, where the alternative was slavery, it was a necessary sacrifice. Jean-Jacques never felt exploited. He felt included. He was not a victim of his parents' war. He was their partner. This shared secret forged a bond between them that was stronger than blood. They were a cell, a unit, united by a singular, dangerous purpose. But the net was tightening. The efficiency of the scientist network had attracted attention. The sheer volume and accuracy of the intelligence flowing out of Le Mans could not be ignored by the Gestapo. They knew there was a leak near the airfield. They just couldn't believe the leak was riding a bicycle. By November 1943, the game of cat and mouse in Le Mans had shifted. The Allies were bombing with greater frequency, and the German security apparatus, stung by the accuracy of the strikes, began to tear the countryside apart, looking for the source of the intelligence. The red zone around the airfield was reinforced with additional checkpoints. The soldiers who once smiled at the boy with the kite were replaced or rotated out. Their successors grim-faced veterans from the Eastern Front, who trusted no one. The atmosphere inside the Auduc home was electric with unspoken dread. They knew a traitor was operating in the sector. Members of the scientist circuit had begun to disappear. Silent arrests in the middle of the night, leaving behind only empty beds and cold meals. Yet, the mission could not stop. London was demanding confirmation of a new Luftwaffe deployment, a squadron of specialized night fighters, equipped with the latest Liechtenstein radar arrays. Jean-Jacques was sent out one last time. It was a grey, freezing afternoon. He cycled to his usual vantage point, but the routine had changed. A staff car, a black Mercedes, was parked near the perimeter fence, unattended. The officer had stepped away to inspect a bunker construction site, leaving the vehicle's window slightly cracked. On the leather passenger seat sat a leather satchel. For a 12-year-old boy, the decision was instantaneous and terrifying. This was not observing from a distance. This was direct interaction with the enemy. Adrenaline flooded his system. He checked the guard tower. The sentry was lighting a cigarette, his back turned for a fraction of a second. Jean-Jacques abandoned his bicycle. He moved low through the tall grass, a shadow against the damp earth. He reached the car. His small hand slipped through the window gap, fingers brushing the cold leather of the seat. He grabbed the handle of the satchel and pulled. It was heavy. He didn't look inside. He didn't pause. He scrambled back to the ditch, shoving the bag under his coat. His heart hammering so hard he felt it would bruise his ribs. He regained his bicycle and pedaled. He did not look back. He expected a shout, a gunshot, the roar of an engine starting. But there was only the wind. He arrived home, breathless, delivering the prize to his father. The satchel contained gold, patrol schedules, frequency codes, and maps of the flak defenses. It was an intelligence coup of the highest order. But it was also a death sentence. The theft of an officer's documents would trigger a localized earthquake of investigation. The Germans would not just search, they would burn the district down to find it. The Auduc family destroyed the bag, photographed the documents, and transmitted the data. They had struck a major blow, but the silence that followed was not the silence of safety. It was the silence of a held breath before the scream. The corbeau, the informant, had finally pinpointed them. The Gestapo knew. The raid was not a possibility anymore. It was a scheduled event. The hammer fell on a cold morning in late 1943. It did not begin with a siren, but with the screech of tires breaking the silence of the street. 3 black Citroën traction avants pulled up to the Auduc residence. The doors flew open, and men in long leather coats and fedoras, the uniform of the Gestapo, spilled out, flanked by armed Wehrmacht soldiers. There was no time to burn the latest codes. There was no time to hide the radio. The front door was kicked in, the wood splintering under the force of a jackboot. The violence was immediate and overwhelming. Furniture was overturned. Drawers were ripped out and dumped onto the floor. And the walls were sounded with rifle butts for hollow spaces. Jean and Biela Auduc were seized before they could reach a weapon. They were thrown against the wall, hands raised, the barrels of MP-40 submachine guns pressed into their spines. Jean-Jacques watched from the periphery, his world fracturing. The men who had come for his parents were efficient predators. They shouted questions in harsh, guttural German, demanding names, demanding frequencies. His parents remained stoic, their faces masks of defiance, even as they were handcuffed. They did not look at their son. To look at him would be to acknowledge him, to draw the wolves' attention to the cub. It was their final act of protection, ignoring him to save him. The Gestapo dragged Jean and Biela out of the house and into the waiting cars. The neighbors watched from behind twitching curtains, paralyzed by fear. As the engines roared and the cars sped away toward the prisons of Le Mans and eventually the camps in Germany, Jean-Jacques was left standing in the wreckage of his childhood home. He was 12 years old, and he was entirely alone. The scientist network had been decapitated, but the Gestapo had made a critical error. They assumed the child was merely collateral damage, a helpless dependent left behind. They did not realize that the boy standing in the shattered living room possessed the mind of a veteran operative. He knew the protocols. He knew that staying in the house was a death sentence. They would come back for him once they realized what he knew. Jean-Jacques did not cry. He moved. He packed a small bag, not with toys but with warm clothes, and the remaining scraps of food. He slipped out the back door, disappearing into the hedgerows he knew so well. He did not go to school. He went to the forest. He sought out the remnants of the local resistance, the Maquis. These were rough men, escaped POWs, communists, and Spanish Republicans living in hidden camps deep in the woods. When a 12-year-old boy walked into their clearing, they were skeptical. But Jean-Jacques did not offer them innocence. He offered them intelligence. He told them where the flak towers were. He told them the patrol routes. He spoke with the authority of a field agent. The Maquisards took him in. They gave him a code name. And then they gave him a weapon. The boy who had flown kites to count bombers traded his spool of string for a Sten gun. He was no longer a spy. He was a soldier of the French forces of the interior. The transition was absolute. He slept on the damp ground, ate what could be scavenged, and learned to ambush German convoys. The child was gone, consumed by the war, replaced by a partisan fighter who looked at the occupation not with fear, but with a cold, lethal resolve. August 1944. The heat of summer lay heavy over the Saarthe, but the air was different now. It no longer carried the drone of the Luftwaffe, but a deep, rhythmic trembling that rose from the earth itself. The liberation was not a polite knock at the door. It was an avalanche of steel. General George S. Patton's Third Army had broken out of Normandy and was tearing across the French countryside. A relentless column of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and dust. On August 8th, the roar of the engines reached the outskirts of Le Mans. The German garrison, once the masters of the city, scrambled to establish defensive lines, but the momentum was against them. In the vanguard of the American advance, the tanks hesitated at the crossroads, the commanders wary of ambushes in the unfamiliar terrain. It was here that the terrorist emerged from the hedgerows. Jean-Jacques Auduc, now 13, walked out to meet the lead Sherman. He was small, disheveled, and looked like a child lost in a war zone. But when he spoke to the American officers, he did not ask for chocolate. He pointed. He traced the lines of the German anti-tank guns hidden in the blind spots. He indicated the strong points he had spent 3 years memorizing. The American commanders, initially baffled by the boy soldier, quickly realized the value of the intelligence. Jean-Jacques climbed onto the hull of a tank, a small figure guiding the juggernaut of the U.S. Army into his own city. The liberation of Le Mans was a blur of violence and jubilation. As the Germans retreated, the streets filled with the tricolor flags that had been hidden for 4 years. Crowds surged around the Americans, offering wine, flowers, and kisses. The church bells, silent for so long, rang out in a chaotic, glorious cacophony. For the city, the nightmare was over. But for Jean-Jacques, the victory rang hollow. As the dust settled and the euphoria of the crowds reached its peak, he made his way back to his family home. The door was still broken. The interior was still ravaged exactly as the Gestapo had left it months before. The silence of the house was deafening compared to the celebration in the streets. There was no mother to embrace him, no father to praise his bravery. The liberation had returned his freedom, but it had not returned his family. The reality of the Holocaust and the concentration system was just beginning to seep into the consciousness of the world. Jean-Jacques waited for news. It came in fragments, carried by the Red Cross and returning deportees. His parents had not been executed in Le Mans. They had been fed into the industrial machinery of the Nazi camp system. His father, Jean, had been sent to Neuengamme, and then Bergen-Belsen. His mother, Biela, was in Ravensbrück, the notorious women's camp. The psychological toll on the 13-year-old was catastrophic. He was a war hero in a nation that was trying to forget the war. He was a child who had seen things that hardened veterans could not process. While his peers returned to school to learn algebra and grammar, Jean-Jacques was processing the trauma of urban combat and the agonizing uncertainty of his parents' fate. He lived in a suspended state, a survivor of a shipwreck waiting on the shore for a vessel that might never return. The aftermath for him was not peace. It was a different kind of war, a war of waiting, of hope battling against probability. The spring of 1945 brought the final collapse of the Third Reich, and with it, the opening of the camp gates. Europe was flooded with millions of displaced persons, a chaotic tide of humanity seeking the way home. For months, Jean-Jacques stood at the precipice of despair, scanning the list of survivors posted by the Ministry of Prisoners, Deportees, and Refugees. Then the miracle happened. In a statistical anomaly that defied the grim odds of the Holocaust, both Jean and Biela Auduc survived. They returned to Le Mans, but they were not the same people who had been dragged out of their home by the Gestapo. They were skeletal, their bodies broken by typhus and starvation, their minds scarred by the horrors of Bergen-Belsen and Ravensbrück. The reunion was not a joyous explosion of laughter, but a tearful, fragile embrace between a son who had grown up too fast and parents who had aged a lifetime in 18 months. The family was whole again, but the shadows of the camps would linger in the corners of their home forever. The French Republic, now reconstituted, moved to recognize those who had bled for its survival. Honors were distributed to the Maquis leaders, the saboteurs, and the intelligence chiefs. But among the lists of hardened men, one name stood out. On a blustery day in the town square, General Louis-Marie Kultz, a distinguished commander of the French army, stood before a rank of soldiers. At the end of the line stood Jean-Jacques Auduc. He was still small for his age, wearing shorts that seemed incongruous next to the military uniform surrounding him. The general did not lean down to speak to a child. He stood at attention to address a soldier. He pinned the Croix de Guerre with a silver star onto the boy's chest. The citation did not mention kite flying or bicycle rides. It cited exceptional courage and vital intelligence gathering in the face of the enemy. Jean-Jacques Auduc became the youngest recipient of the Croix de Guerre in the history of the order. Later, he would also receive the Legion of Honor. These were not honorary titles given to a mascot. They were combat decorations awarded to an operative. The military establishment had been forced to acknowledge a new reality of modern warfare. In a total conflict, the front line is everywhere, and a 12-year-old with a sharp memory is as dangerous to the enemy as a sniper. This recognition solidified his place in history, but it also marked the end of his war. The guns fell silent, the kites were put away, or perhaps flown just for the joy of seeing them dance in the wind, untethered from the grim calculus of triangulation. Jean-Jacques returned to the obscurity of civilian life, a schoolboy with a medal in his drawer and the silence of the secrets he had kept. The story of Jean-Jacques Auduc is not merely a chronicle of bravery, it is a stark testament to the total, consuming nature of the Second World War. In previous centuries, wars were fought on defined battlefields by uniformed men, leaving the civilian population largely on the periphery. But the occupation of France shattered this distinction. The front line was not a trench system. It was the dining room table, the schoolyard, and the perimeter fence of an airfield. Jean-Jacques represents the ultimate desperation and the ultimate resolve of a nation under the heel of a conqueror. That a resistance network felt compelled to weaponize a 12-year-old boy reveals the terrifying stakes of the conflict. It shows us that when freedom is threatened with extinction, the conventional morality of protecting children yields to the primal necessity of survival. The Auduc family did not sacrifice their son's safety lightly. They recognized that in a world ruled by the Gestapo, no child was safe anyway. Silence was not protection. Action was the only shield. His story also forces a re-evaluation of the concept of the soldier. Jean-Jacques wore short pants instead of fatigues, and his primary weapon was a kite made of wood and paper. Yet his contribution was as lethal as a sniper's bullet. He exploited the one weakness the Nazi war machine could not armor itself against: its own assumptions. The Germans saw a child and saw only innocence. They could not conceive that the capacity for resistance, for deception, and for courage exists independent of age. They underestimated the human spirit, believing it could be crushed by tanks and terror, forgetting that it often burns brightest in the unlikeliest of places. Today, the medal pinned to his chest sits in a display case, a piece of silver and ribbon that carries a weight far greater than its physical mass. It is a symbol of a stolen childhood, traded willingly for the liberation of his country. When we look back at the liberation of Europe, we see the armies, the generals, and the armadas. But in the shadow of those giants stands a boy with a bicycle, reminding us that history is not just made by the powerful. Sometimes the course of a war is altered by a child who simply refuses to look away.